Well, I can see the attraction of keeping the war going, though, for the Europeans. That is, if it pulls the United States back into Europe as it does now, then the Europeans would have a powerful America standing behind them, and they would have, Zelensky standing in front of them, willing to send every single Ukrainian to the front if necessary to weaken Russia. So it does, it gives Europeans some, well, a favorable position, if you will. That being said, um, I'm wondering also if they actually know what's actually happening on the front lines, because it's important to understand if you, well, in any European country now, if you say that, well, the Russians are winning, this is considered to be pro-Russian argument. So, there's no discussions at all about objective reality. How do you measure what's happening on the ground? It's just recognizing, reality. If it doesn't fit well with, the narrative, it's simply considered to be pro-Russian or anti-Ukrainian. So everyone kind of has to say the exact same thing, and it doesn't have to be based on any evidence. It's just, it was a bit like Nord Stream. If you said, oh, well, that makes no sense that Russia would blow up their own infrastructure, well, that would be considered to be a pro-Russian thing to say. So everyone, no matter how silly it sounded, everyone had to essentially repeat the same mantra, and it's quite ridiculous. But this is where Europe is at the moment. So I'm wondering if they actually know what's happening, because if everyone is saying the same thing, in human nature we tend to adjust to the group. But no, I'm also worried though that if they set these dates, the war will start in 2029. We'll prepare our military infrastructure at some point. Why would the Russians wait? Wait a bit like the Iranians. Why would they wait for the adversary to shape the battlefield exactly the way they want it before the firing begin? I just seems to me that the Russians would throw the first punch, as they did now in Ukraine, if they think peace is impossible. Anyways, you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I think what you see here, Glenn, is that the Europeans are getting more and more involved in what's going on in Ukraine. The European commitment to Ukraine is deepening. Uh, and you just sort of say to yourself, how does this one end? In other words, what if the Russians uh, begin to roll up the Ukrainians on the battlefield? You and I think that the Russians are winning the war. They're winning it at a slow pace, but there's no question in my mind, and I think it's true of you as well, that the Russians are on the offensive and they are succeeding on the battlefield, albeit slowly. So the question is, if the Ukrainian military begins to crack, what are the Europeans going to do at that point in time? Again, you just want to think about how deeply committed the Europeans are to this war. And if it looks like Ukraine is going to lose and Ukraine then begins to lose, what are the Europeans going to do? Are they going to just say, well, we tried, we lost, that's the end of it? Or are they going to try to escalate? Are they going to try to rescue the situation? Are they going to become desperate? Uh, that's one side of the equation. But then there's the Russian side of the equation. What if the long range drone war is really beginning to affect the Russian economy and they're getting desperate? What if the pressure on Putin is growing greatly because this war has just dragged on for so long that he feels he has to do something to end it? Or to go back to the drone campaign, he has to go back to end the drone campaign, or to go back to the battlefield, he has to do something to speed up the victory. What if forces like that begin to come into play in a major way on the Russian side? What are they going to do? Aren't they going to escalate? So what I'm saying to you, Glenn, is if you sort of think about where this one is going, you can tell a story where the Europeans are put in a position where they have to escalate, and the Russians are put in a position where they have to escalate. And let's say that doesn't happen, and the war just goes on and on. Is it really feasible for this war to last for another 2 or 3 years? Isn't one side going to try to do something at one point to put an end to it? And here we're talking mainly about the Russians. And then the question is, how does that play itself out? What I think I'm saying here is that this is a very dangerous situation. I think early on in the war, it was possible to walk away from the war for the Europeans and for the Americans. And it was possible for the Russians to make a compromise deal back then. This was certainly true at Istanbul. If you think about where we were at Istanbul compared to where we are now and where we seem to be headed, uh, I mean, the idea that the United States is now sort of back in the fight and Trump is enthusiastic about new sanctions, really serious secondary sanctions against Russia, and that we're going to, we meaning the West in this case, go to great lengths to help uh, Ukraine ramp up the drone campaign against Mother Russia. I mean, I don't see how this has a happy ending. The Russians can only tolerate so much. And then the Sergei Karaganov logic comes into play. You're backing a great power into a corner. So, and then just to repeat myself, to go back to the European side of things or the Western side of things, we're now so deeply involved in this war, so deeply committed that losing is not going to be easy. And by the way, just to expand on this, Glenn, let's just talk about the Americans. We talked earlier about the fact that the Americans have effectively suffered a humiliating defeat in the Middle East. Let's assume that that defeat is codified in a new memorandum of understanding at some point. And then after that, it looks like the Ukrainian military is collapsing and the Russians are going to win. And we, the United States, are backing the Ukrainians. This would be a second defeat in a row. What is the United States going to do in that circumstance? Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that's going to happen. As you and I both know, who knows for sure exactly what's going to happen? We're kind of feeling our way around in the dark here. But we can tell all sorts of plausible stories about how this really ends up. Here we're talking about the Ukraine war in a disastrous way. This is it's just a very dangerous situation. And all the forces are pushing the situation in more dangerous ways, not in less dangerous ways. It's not like I expect when you and I talk a month from now or 2 months from now, we will be saying, thank goodness that these set of decisions were made so that the temperature has been lowered. If anything, I think you and I expect the temperature to rise. And this is a very dangerous situation, especially when you consider that the Russians have nuclear weapons and the Americans have nuclear weapons as well.
Yeah, well, I never hear any arguments though in terms of how this is going to end positively, because in Europe they're all very enthusiastic about sending weapons. They're talking about, how many Russians they're killing, all of these things, but yeah, they never get into it. How do they expect the Russians to respond? Because the assumption is always, if we just make sure more Russians are dying, the war will become more unpopular and Putin will have to walk away. And, my question would always be, well, Russia can't walk away because this is an existential threat for them. They know what's going to happen if Russia walks away at some point. Well, Starmer dress have said what will happen. NATO troops will begin to move into Ukraine. They will pack the country up with drones and long-range missiles. And And much like the day after the coup in 2014, you're going to have CIA bases appearing across the Russian border to destabilize Russia. So this isn't acceptable. This idea that if you just kill enough of Russian soldiers, weaken them, then somehow they will just pack up and submit, capitulate. It just seems like a fantasy. There is This is only heading towards a massive war. And if they don't have conventional, if we have exhausted their conventional military capabilities, well, it's a bit like the Iranian logic. Well, then they need a nuclear deterrence, same as the Russians. If we are able to exhaust them, they will have to use nuclear weapons instead. They're not going to capitulate. I mean, it should all be obvious, but the thing is, as I said, in Europe, if you say that it's an existential threat for the Russians, that's considered to be a pro-Russian argument, because the only acceptable answer is that this is opportunistic imperialism. Putin woke up one day, he wanted territory. This is the only thing that the war is about. So when Russia leaves, the war is over. This is the logic. And if you argue against it, it's a pro-Russian argument, which means you're gone. No one can have a discussion with you. So I don't see any possible solutions. I think it's only escalation from here on, and we're heading towards war.
I would just say, Glenn, and I believe I've said this on the show before, we never did any of this in the Cold War. We did not behave like this because we fully understood that backing the Russians into a corner would potentially lead to disaster. We're talking about a country that's armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. The idea that we're going to knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers and get away with that scot-free? Why does anybody believe that? I mean, we did not believe that during the Cold War. Some people thought you could defeat the Soviet Union with a splendid first strike. In other words, just go in with your nuclear arsenal and eliminate their ability to fight a nuclear war or any other kind of war. You could win with a nuclear first strike. Some people believed that early in the Cold War. But other than that, the idea that you could sort of back the Russians into a corner and bring them to their knees, I mean, it just didn't think this way. By the way, think about the end of the Cold War and think about the brilliant job that the President George H.W. Bush administration did in ending the Cold War. They went to great length, as you well remember, not to humiliate the Russians and to let the Russians down gently, because they understood that they were dealing with a nuclear armed superpower and they didn't want to back it into a corner. They knew it had to be treated gently. But we have given up thinking about the world in those terms. It's really quite remarkable. There was an article recently in Foreign Affairs, and I love the title of the article. It's called The Strange Defeat of Nuclear Deterrence. The Strange Defeat of Nuclear Deterrence. And the woman, Rose Gottmuller, who wrote the piece, is, basically talking about the fact that nuclear deterrence, which seemed to matter so much in the past because people understood the basic logic in very important ways, is not understood by all sorts of people. They don't think that nuclear deterrence applies very much in the Russian case. They think the fact that the Russians have nuclear weapons and have red lines doesn't really matter. You can push the Russians around and get away with it. Again, that's not the way we thought in the Cold War. We fully understood once they had an assured destruction capability that you better be extremely careful in dealing with the Russians. When they went into Hungary in 56 and Czechoslovakia in 68, do you think we helped the Hungarians or the Czechoslovakians? Absolutely not, for good strategic reasons. We didn't want to threaten the survival or the great power status of the Soviet Union. The same logic should apply here, but it doesn't seem to apply. And where all this ends is very hard to say, but it is hard to tell a story where you have a happy ending.
I agree. Well, on that as well, I've heard that comment as well, that if I have warned that, we should be worried pushing the Russians too far because they have a nuclear deterrent. Well, respecting the nuclear deterrent, that's also pro-Russian, because now it means we're empowering Putin to use nuclear weapons for blackmail. So there is yeah, the thinking is terrifying. I was kind of hoping for a while that this kind of rhetoric was merely, setting up a favorable negotiation position, but I've become very convinced that they believe in their own nonsense, essentially, and that's yeah, kind of terrifying, to be honest.
Well, if
Anyway.
anything, all this makes meaningful negotiations less possible. Right. What's paradoxical here is that people in the West, and this includes President Trump now, think that putting greater pressure on Russia, either with drones or sanctions, increases the chances of bringing them to the negotiating table. They've got it completely backwards. It's going to have exactly the opposite effect. It's going to lead to Sergei Karaganov.
I agree. I just saw the different EU leaders with Zelensky in Paris, and they were with more. We need to strike more in Russia because this will bring Putin to the negotiation table. He was at the negotiation table. It's the Europeans that refuse to even talk. They want to sit at the table, but they don't want to talk to Russia. None of this makes any sense at all. But and then you have Starmer. He came out with this argument that we need peace now, same as Merz, and peace means ceasefire. And as soon as the ceasefire is in place, NATO troops can move into Ukraine. I mean, but everyone, I think with a little bit of ability to think, would know that this would cancel the possibility of any peace if this is what peace means. But again, I'm not sure if they believe their own nonsense, or if this is just yeah, a way of deceiving. Anyways, we're living in the age of political midgets, it seems. There's this it's we really need the old statesmen back, I think, the Cold War statesmen. But yeah, here we are.
I think, Glenn, just my final point on this, I think that what we need are strategic thinkers. And I think what we need is an elite in Europe and in the United States that thinks strategically. And I think what happened is that during the unipolar moment, when the United States was the only great power on the planet, Russia was badly weakened, China was not yet a great power. The United States and its European allies developed a way of looking at the world that was at odds with basic balance of power politics, that paid little attention to nuclear deterrence and red lines. And we came to think, we in the West came to think that international politics had fundamentally changed, and the United States could do pretty much anything it wants and get its way. And I think that's carried over into the present, into the new multipolar world that we live in. And I think that I find it quite remarkable how little most people who came of age in the unipolar moment know about nuclear deterrence. During the Cold War, everybody who moved into the strategic realm, who got interested in national security affairs, got schooled on the ABCs of nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence. You learned to think about great power politics in quite sophisticated ways because we all understood that we were operating in a very dangerous world. In unipolarity, that went away because there was only one great power, the United States. And the United States and its European allies thought that they were pretty much free to do everything. And those old rules had gone away, and worrying about nuclear deterrence didn't matter that much. Then we moved back into this new multipolar world in around 2017. And it appears to be the case that most people have not really come to terms with the fact that we're back in the realm of great power politics. We're back in a world where nuclear deterrence really matters, and you have to think seriously about what it means to live in a nuclear world and what you can do vis-a-vis other powers that happen to have nuclear arsenals of their own. I mean, people like you and I, we talk similar to the way we talked back in the Cold War. But all sorts of other people, when you listen to them talk, have a very different way of thinking about the world. And it's all very dangerous. And you see this manifested in the way the Europeans and even the Americans treat the Russians these days. Again, we would have never done this in the Cold War.
Guess it will take some time for the thinking to change. Hopefully, yeah, the learning curve will be a little bit steeper, so we don't end up in a massive war with the Russians. Anyways, John, as always, thank you so much for taking the time. It's always enlightening.
My pleasure, Glenn.